Hello everyone, it's your favorite night owl here, recording from the greatest state in the Union. Recording a video on the ideal battleship. Now, this will be mostly from my personal biases and information I've gathered on the topic. Before we get started, this video is completely unsponsored, not sponsored by any brand names that may or may not be mentioned or viewed within this video. Fantastic, let's get on with it, shall we? Alrighty then. As to the topic at hand, as previously mentioned, it is on the ideal battleship. However, what is ideal can vary wildly from person to person. In fact, I believe this topic can actually go into justifying the re-emergence of the battleship onto modern, ocean-going navies. Absolutely fantastic. Now, this is a bit of a tricky topic because people's ideals of what is ideal can vary, so we need a baseline criteria on what is a battleship. And the general colloquial idea, if you play like World of Warships or War Thunder, is a ship with, my pardon, it's been a rather hot day, is a ship with 11-inch guns or greater. And in some cases, I think, in some games, they also include armor belt thickness in consideration as well, and general weight. Historically, weight has been a factor in what something is considered a designed role, size of the guns, which, generally speaking, from a historical standpoint, what I can find is that the maximum size for what can be considered a cruiser-grade gun is 10 inches. Although some, on the other hand, have produced so-called armored cruisers that had 11-inch guns, more famously known as the pocket battleships. But essentially they were heavy cruisers with battleship-grade guns. What is the difference between a cruiser and a battleship if it has the same caliber guns? Well, armor, because then we can get into a different criteria. Is it armored against smaller caliber cruiser grade guns, so maximum of 10 inches, to, of course, other matters like, is it matched against its own guns, which in theory are at minimum 11 inches, or at least, very least, its armored belt. However, this can vary considering that the armored belt, the extent of the armored belt, and, well, again, weight can also be a factor, although that probably sounds pretty confusing because the topic is very varied online and from even historical references I found. Generally speaking, it is wildly debated what can be considered other than just big gun, big ship. Of course, under the notion, big ship, big gun, this can vary wildly because right now it's pretty standard in the world that both cruisers and destroyers are overwhelmingly only equipped with cannon that are roughly 5 inches. I think Russia has 13 centimeter guns, which are basically 5 inches, maybe 5.1. And that brings up a interesting idea, thought experiment. If the new standard for cruiser is 5 inches, then in theory the battleship's armored belt only needs to be sufficient up to the modern caliber, which is standard. As to my knowledge, there are no more 8-inch gun cruisers, so you don't need an 8-inch or 9-inch belt. And if the worldwide standard seems to mostly be 4 or 5 inches, then you really only need like a 6-inch armor belt. Although you may want to armor against what a theoretical maximum for a cruiser is. Although that maximum can change. For example, the British large light cruisers, which had 15-inch guns slapped on them, with, like, I think maybe a 3-inch armored belt, I think. That is a hard maybe. But That is based on my best recollection. Now, the concept of a large light cruiser could be argued to be what could be considered a third-rate battleship. It had battleship-grade guns, but armor that barely qualified for cruisers, and even some destroyers could, at the time, match if they had decent armor belts on them. Although not always the case, because destroyers were generally at the time still fairly light and small. When there are many ships of the time that really didn't have any armored belts, that really weren't armored and were essentially still considered combat capable, just like today. There's many very light ships that basically have no armor on them. Heavy armor on ships has been out of fashion for a while. Now, in the case of a battleship, part of their design is centered around their capability to slug it out at close range. But the primary ship killer to consider would be, say, a Harpoon or some of the bigger anti-ship missiles, which are subsonic, and not to mention the supersonic ones, which I could not find a data point in my cursory overview of information I dug up that would give any sort of estimation on how much armor could they penetrate. Now, at the end of the day, that means the standard would, in theory, remain, unless those studies are done, be able to, at the very least, protect themselves from cruiser-grade cannon, with then relying on active protection systems and, of course, passive protection systems in order to, well, shoot down, confuse, or just go unnoticed by anti-ship missiles through, low radar absorbability, chaff, other countermeasures, close-in weapon systems, long-range air defense systems. Those would be considered the most appropriate for things like anti-ship missiles. However, because they are battleships, the general idea is they would still engage surface vessels more directly. So a Navy that's focused on sweeping the sea of potential problems may be interested, or at the very least is concerned about having heavy shore bombardment capability, might be interested in such a concept, because in theory they do not need to be as big as they were. Things like the Alaska-class cruisers. Also, I saw some things calling them battle cruisers, large cruisers, cruiser killers. Then you had the, pocket battleships of Germany, which had 11-inch guns. So, in theory, right now, a battleship would only have a 6-inch armor belt, which means it could remain relatively light. And even if you want to expand it inside, because that was one of the big downsides of battleships towards the end, was their massively expanding size to defend from the massively expanding, capability of cannon-based artillery. So we needed heavier ships to defend from 15-inch guns, from 16-inch guns, and eventually 18-inch guns as things continued to progress. This, however, is what eventually led to their demise. Rather than looking at the practicalities of they only need to be protected against the largest cruiser-grade artillery, and then they only need artillery capable of defeating the armor of other battleships, which would be their own size. And this can also be mitigated if you're that concerned about long-term viability, like someone creating a battleship specifically to sink yours. You could easily have a less expensive battleship that's only armored against modern cruisers, is protected the rest of the way by modern technology and weapon systems, have heavy guns of say, 11 or 12 inches, and that would be like your second-rate or mainline battleship, which then you could have an elite core of basically a few heavier battleships meant to sink those as a backup plan. That would predominantly the lighter battleships being used to escort one of the more valuable assets in any navy, which is aircraft carriers, with the heavier battleships reserved for large fleet action. Now, this would mean taking resources away from something like carriers, But the lighter end of the potential modern battleship range, 11-inch guns with 6-inch armor belts, which could be pretty expansive depending on the size of the ship, and you could concentrate a lot of the efforts on just, if you were to go to the 50, 60,000 ton range with something like that, you'd focus on carrying cargo capacity, essentially use them like really heavy gun assault ships. And there's also all kinds of developments in later stage battleships that allowed them to put heavier armor on while keeping the ship in the same weight classes, which could be applied to keeping a modern development of a battleship even lighter than, say, it might necessarily need to be. Because the modern standard, and there is the argument that people will just start upgunning their cruisers, of course, but why, when anti-ship missiles are the primary killer for ships? Of course, under that same argument, why the battleship? Well, a heavy escort for the carriers. That would make it next to impossible for surface ships of a lighter standing, modern cruisers and destroyers, to get close, to try to finish a carrier off should their anti-ship missiles fail to sink. Any sort of, not to mention other surface combatants, and offer heavy shore bombardment, which would be insanely valuable to modern, at the very least, amphibious forces, something heavy to escort them. Because, why waste an anti-ship missile on a landing ship, a large landing ship or assault ship, when you can just roll up with a destroyer and gun it down? Of course, I may be misreading all this. I am not a strategic mind genius when it comes to naval warfare. I'm just a cursory observer who enjoys the topic. So, at the end of the day, it is, from my perspective, possible, and I'd like to hear from people in the comment section that may know more than me. Well, thank you for your time. Like, share, and subscribe. Sorry for the quick sudden, if you like, ending. I guess I'll be seeing every round. Like if you like, please subscribe, share, even if it's for your more expertised friends to mock me. I do appreciate the feedback, positive or negative. Well, I guess I'll be seeing everyone around as previously stated. Toodles!